In the year of our Lord 1814, the Texas frontier stretched out like some great, breathing beast, a vast and merciless expanse of untamed wilderness where the very air seemed thick with both promise and peril. Our settlement, which bore the name Blackwood, stood as but a fragile bastion of human endeavor amidst an endless, brooding sea of pine and thorn and shadow. We numbered scarcely 60 souls in those days, a collection of hardened men, weary women, and quiet children bound together not by choice or kinship, but by the shared, grinding burden of survival in a land that seemed perpetually poised to reclaim what little we had wrested from it. Our lives were governed by the simple, brutal rhythms of the axe and the plow, our morals forged in the twin fires of Old Testament scripture and the stark, unforgiving realities of the frontier. It was a hard life, but one of a certain grim order, until that order was shattered. The Collins family had been among the very first to stake their claim in this remote corner of the territory, their homestead carved from the unyielding land a full mile east of the village proper, closer to the dark, dense woods from which our settlement took its name. Josiah Collins was a man of formidable presence, a figure who seemed hewn from the very oak and granite of the land itself. He stood a head taller than most men, broad-shouldered and thick-limbed, with a face perpetually tanned to the texture of old leather and eyes the color of a winter sky that held no discernible warmth. He was a man of few words, his silence speaking louder than the boasts of other men, and he commanded a wary, grudging respect from the community, the kind born not from affection or leadership, but from a primal, instinctual understanding of his sheer physical power and a capacity for violence that simmered just beneath his stoic surface. His wife, Martha, was his opposite in every visible way, a spectral, faded figure who seemed to have been weathered away by some private, relentless storm. She appeared beside him in our small, plain church on Sundays, a woman drowned in a simple gray dress, her gaze forever fixed upon the rough-hewn floorboards as if seeking some escape, her pale, thin hands clutching her hymn book not with devotion, but like a shield against the world. Their son, Elijah, a youth of 17, was the very image of his father in both his powerful, nascent physique and his unsettling, watchful silence. He mirrored Josiah's stance, his expressions, his way of moving through the world as a predator moves through its territory, aware of everything yet revealing nothing. They were a closed circle, the Collinses, a self-contained unit that offered no friendship, asked for no assistance, and accepted no invitations. They traded for necessities with quiet efficiency, their needs seemingly as minimal as their words. We in Blackwood thought them peculiar, perhaps even cursed with a melancholic humor, but on the frontier, peculiarity was a common coin. We had our drunks and our dreamers, our zealots and our broken men fleeing pasts best left unspoken. The Collins family simply kept to their own, and we, grateful for the distance, kept to ours. For a time, this arrangement sufficed. The first true, chilling whisper of the horror to come, however, arrived not as a sight, but as a sound carried on the wind. It was Old Man Haggerty, a veteran of the wilderness whose meager, weed-choked plot bordered the Collins land, who first gave voice to the unease. He spoke of a noise that carried on the night wind when it blew from the east, a faint, rhythmic, almost musical clinking, like metal tapping upon metal. At first, we paid his ramblings little mind, attributing them to the fancies of an aging man too fond of his own potent moonshine. A loose shutter, the more pragmatic among us suggested. A wind chime of some sort, offered others, though none could recall ever seeing such a frivolity on the Collinses' stark and functional property. But then the children began to vanish. It started with young Samuel Miller, a bright and spirited lad of 8 years with a head full of adventure and a heart too brave for his own good. He had gone out one crisp autumn afternoon to check his rabbit snares, the ones he had set to the north, in the very woods that separated the village from the Collins land. When he failed to return for supper, a familiar, parental worry began to curdle into panic. We organized search parties, scores of men with grim faces beating through the thick, grasping undergrowth, our calls of "Samuel" echoing into a silent, uncaring wilderness that gave back no answer. We searched until darkness forced us to retreat, and again at first light. We found nothing. Not a scrap of clothing, not a single broken branch, not one clear footprint. It was as if the earth had simply opened its maw and swallowed him whole, leaving not even a whisper behind. A heavy, suffocating pall of dread fell over Blackwood. The woods, once a source of game and timber, now seemed a place of malevolent watchfulness. A month later, the terror returned, this time striking with a cruelty that felt personal. The two Henderson sisters, Mary and Abigail, aged 10 and 12, quiet and pious girls, had gone to pick the last of the season's blackberries in that same cursed stretch of woods. They, too, stepped across some unseen threshold and disappeared from the face of the earth. Their mother's raw, animal screams of anguish, a sound that tore through the settlement, still haunt the quiet moments of my mind. Panic, now cold and sharp as a skinning knife, began to seep into the very timbers of our homes. Whispers of Comanche raiding parties were hastily debated and just as quickly dismissed. There were no moccasin tracks, no signs of a struggle, no warning cries heard. The forest offered no explanation. It was simply hungry. And through it all, through the grief and the fear, Old Man Haggerty insisted, his voice trembling with a terror that was no longer born of liquor but of a dreadful certainty, that the clinking from the Collins land had changed. It had grown louder, more distinct. It was no longer a random, wind-borne tapping, he claimed, but a deliberate, rhythmic, almost methodical sound, like a hammer steadily, patiently working upon an anvil deep within the earth. It was a sound that seemed to mock our communal grief, a metallic heartbeat pulsing from the very property that bordered the woods which had stolen our children. The peculiar family had become the focus of our darkest, most unspoken suspicions, a silent, brooding presence at the edge of our world. The time for whispers and worried glances was over. The men of Blackwood, our faces set like stone, armed with flintlock rifles and a mounting, righteous fury, would pay a formal visit to Josiah Collins. We would look him in his cold, winter-blue eyes and demand answers. The walk to the Collins homestead that October morning was a somber and silent procession. There were 8 of us, the steadiest men Blackwood could muster, our boots crunching on the frost-hardened earth, the early mist clinging to our wool coats like a shroud. I led the party, my constable's badge a cold, insignificant weight upon my chest. Beside me walked Reverend Albright, his Bible clutched in his hand, a testament to our hope that this could be resolved with reason and faith, though the set of his jaw betrayed his own doubts. The others, Miller, the blacksmith, Henderson, hollow-eyed with grief, and 4 other farmers, formed a grim phalanx at our backs. We were not a mob, not yet, but the potential for violence hung in the air, as palpable as the scent of pine and damp soil. The Collins property, when we reached it, did nothing to allay our fears. Where our own plots showed the gentle disorder of ongoing life, woodpiles, laundry lines, the scatter of children's toys, their land was unnaturally stark. The small cabin was solidly built but devoid of any warmth or charm, its windows dark and shuttered. A single, stunted oak tree, its branches skeletal against the gray sky, stood sentinel in the bare yard. No smoke curled from the chimney. The only sign of recent work was a vast stack of freshly split firewood, each log uniform in size, piled with a precision that felt almost obsessive. It was a place of function, utterly devoid of spirit. As we approached the porch, the door swung open before we could even knock. Josiah Collins stood there, his massive frame filling the doorway, a long-barreled hunting rifle held loosely but purposefully in the crook of his arm. He did not speak. His cold eyes scanned our group, lingering for a moment on Henderson's grief-ravaged face before settling on me. "Josiah," I began, my voice sounding too loud in the heavy silence. "We've come on a grave matter. The missing children." "We heard," he said, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. "A tragedy. But it's no business of ours. We keep to our own." "The sound, Josiah?" Old Man Haggerty piped up from the back of our group, his courage bolstered by our numbers. "That damned clinking at all hours. It's gotten louder since the young uns went missing." A flicker of something, annoyance, or perhaps something darker, passed behind Josiah's eyes. "I work my forge at night. The wind carries the sound. That is all." Reverend Albright stepped forward, his voice taking on the placating tone he used in sermons. "Brother Collins, We are all God-fearing men here, bound in Christian fellowship. We must help one another in times of trouble. If you have seen anything, heard anything, the Henderson girls, little Samuel Miller, their families are desperate. It was then that Martha Collins appeared, a pale, fluttering ghost behind her husband's shoulder. Her eyes, wide and fearful, darted over our faces. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but Josiah shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that nonetheless silenced her utterly. She retreated back into the gloom of the cabin. "The woods are vast and old," Josiah said, his gaze unwavering. "They hold dangers every man here knows well. Wolves, cougars. Or perhaps the children simply wandered too far and lost their way. It is a harsh land. It claims the unwary." His words were reasonable, but they were delivered with a chilling lack of empathy. He spoke of the possible deaths of 3 children with the same dispassion a man might use to discuss the weather. "My girls wouldn't wander off," Henderson cried out, his voice cracking. "They knew those woods." Josiah's stare was implacable. Then perhaps something lured them. An uneasy silence fell. His implication was clear, and it shifted the blame back upon us, upon the mysterious perils of the forest we all feared. We had no proof, only suspicion and the testimony of a shaky old man about a noise. We were men of the law and the church, and we could not storm a man's property on such flimsy grounds. The righteousness that had fueled our march here began to drain away, leaving behind a cold pool of frustration and helplessness. "We will be watching, Josiah," I said, my tone formal, the authority of my office all I had left to assert. "If there is anything at all that you are not telling us, I will find out." He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture that was neither agreement nor defiance, but a simple acknowledgement of a stated fact. "Do your duty, Constable. I will do mine." With that, he stepped back and closed the door, the solid thud of the latch sliding home a sound of finality. We were left standing in his barren yard, defeated by his silence and our own lack of evidence. As we turned to trek back to the village, the wind picked up, and this time, we all heard it, a faint, metallic, chiming sound, like iron links shifting against one another, drifting from the direction of a low, sod-roofed root cellar dug into a small rise behind the cabin. It was the first time any of us besides Haggerty had heard it clearly. We exchanged grim looks. Our official business was concluded, but a deeper, more primal investigation had just begun. The Collins family was hiding something, and the secret, we now knew, was buried in the earth behind their home. The days that followed our confrontation at the Collins homestead draped themselves over Blackwood like a funeral shroud. The bravado we had carried with us on our march had evaporated, leaving behind a residue of impotent dread. Josiah's cold, logical dismissal of our concerns had been more unnerving than any outright denial or show of anger could have been. He had not defended himself with passion, but with a chilling, almost academic detachment that made our own fears seem like the ravings of hysterical women. Yet, that single, faint, metallic sound we had all heard from the root cellar as we departed had taken root in our minds, a seed of certainty that grew in the dark soil of our suspicion. Life in the settlement took on a strained, watchful quality. Men went about their chores with their rifles closer to hand, their eyes darting nervously towards the tree line. The women gathered their children closer, no longer allowing them to play at the forest's edge, their voices hushed as they spoke of the Collins family in tones once reserved for speaking of plague or damnation. Reverend Albright's sermons turned from themes of grace and salvation to dire warnings from the book of Deuteronomy, speaking of secret abominations and the curse that falls upon those who turn away from the light. He never mentioned the Collinses by name, but every soul in the pews knew where his gaze lingered. I found myself walking the perimeter of the Collins property at odd hours, my constable's duty now a personal obsession. I saw little. Josiah and Elijah would emerge to tend to their few animals or split more of that impossibly neat firewood, their movements efficient and synchronized, like parts of a single machine. Martha was never seen outside. Sometimes, I would catch a glimpse of her pale face at an upstairs window, a fleeting moon in the cabin's darkness, before she would quickly draw back out of sight. It was during these vigils that I became certain of another thing. The clinking sound was not constant. It had a pattern. It would cease for hours, then begin again, sometimes a slow, dragging sound, other times a faster, more frantic tapping. It was not the work of a loose shutter. It was the sound of activity. The breaking point came from an unexpected source. A week after our visit, I was mending a fence near the edge of the village when young Elijah Collins emerged from the woods. He carried a dead turkey slung over his shoulder, his father's rifle in his other hand. He was a handsome boy in a rough-hewn way, but his eyes, so like his father's, held a strange, vacant quality that belied his physical strength. He made to pass me without a word, as was his custom. "Elijah," I said, my voice calm, non-confrontational. He stopped, his body tense, and turned those pale eyes on me. He did not speak. "That's a fine bird," I continued, gesturing to the turkey. "Your mother will be pleased." A flicker of something, confusion, crossed his features. She doesn't eat much," he said, his voice a rusty, unused instrument. "It's a hard time for everyone," I said, taking a step closer, lowering my voice as if sharing a confidence. "The missing children. A terrible thing. A man can't help but wonder if you've seen anything out here in the woods. Heard anything strange." I watched him carefully. His jaw tightened. His gaze shifted from my face to a point somewhere over my shoulder, towards his own home. He was not a skilled liar. The truth was a physical pressure inside him. "Pa says the woods are old," he recited, his words clearly a learned lesson. "They hold dangers." "I'm sure they do," I agreed softly. "But sometimes the danger isn't in the woods, son. Sometimes it's closer to home." His eyes snapped back to mine, wide with a sudden, startling fear. It was not the fear of a guilty man, but the terror of a trapped one. He opened his mouth, and for a heart-stopping moment, I believed he would speak. I saw the words forming on his lips. But then, from the direction of his homestead, carried on the wind, came the distinct, clear sound of a hammer striking metal, 3 sharp, deliberate rings, like a signal. Elijah flinched as if struck. The moment of vulnerability vanished, replaced by the familiar, impenetrable mask. "I have to go," he muttered, and without another word, he strode off towards home, his pace quickening with every step. I stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs. That single, unguarded look in Elijah's eyes had confirmed everything. He knew. He was afraid. And someone, his father, most likely, was controlling him with signals from that damn cellar. The official channels had failed. The direct confrontation had yielded nothing. A deeper, more desperate course of action was now required. We could not storm the property by daylight, but under the cover of darkness, with a small, trusted group, we could investigate that root cellar. It was a violation of a man's home, a trespass that went against every principle I held. But the memory of Samuel Miller's laughing eyes and the Henderson girls' quiet smiles outweighed my scruples. The law, I reasoned, was meant to protect the innocent. If it could not do so by daylight, then it must operate in the shadows. The time for asking questions was over. The time for uncovering answers had begun. The decision to breach the Collins property under the cloak of night was not made lightly. It was a moral chasm we crossed in the hushed confines of the church vestry, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and fear. Present were myself, Reverend Albright, whose faith now warred with a grim necessity, Jacob Henderson, whose grief had hardened into a cold, sharp weapon, and Thomas Miller, the blacksmith, a man of few words but formidable strength. We were 4 souls bound by a shared dread, our faces illuminated by a single guttering candle that cast dancing, monstrous shadows upon the walls. "We tread on dangerous ground, Ezekiel," the Reverend murmured, his fingers tracing the worn leather of his Bible. "To violate a man's home, it is a sin before God and a crime before man." "And what of the sin of inaction?" Henderson's voice was a raw scrape of sound. "What of the crime committed against my girls? I will not stand by while that thing in the cellar continues its work. I heard it last night, clear as a bell. Not a hammer, not anymore. It was a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across dirt." Miller nodded, his massive arms crossed over his chest. "The boy knows something. I saw him in the woods yesterday, near the spot where he vanished. He was just standing there, staring at the ground. When he saw me, he ran like the devil himself was on his heels. The plan was simple, born of desperation. We would wait for the moon to be shrouded by cloud cover. We would approach from the western tree line, using the woods for cover until we reached the root cellar. Henderson, whose eyes were sharpest, and Miller, whose strength could force a locked door, would descend. I would stand guard outside, my pistol a small, cold comfort against the unknown. Reverend Albright would keep watch from the edge of the woods, a silent prayer on his lips, our moral anchor in the encroaching dark. The night was unnaturally still, as if the very earth was holding its breath. A thick blanket of cloud obscured the stars, and a low-lying fog began to coil around the bases of the pines, muffling our footsteps. The journey to the Collins property felt like a descent into another world. The familiar path was transformed into a tunnel of shadows, every rustle of a nocturnal creature sending a jolt of adrenaline through our veins. From the Collins cabin, no light shone. It was a tomb. We reached the edge of the clearing. The root cellar was a low, humped structure built into a small rise, its door a slanted, heavy-looking thing of thick timber, reinforced with iron bands. It looked less like a place for storing potatoes and more like a fortress door. As we crouched in the tree line, we heard it again, the sound that had driven us here. But it was different up close, stripped of the wind's distortion. It was a soft, rhythmic scraping, punctuated by a faint, wet, clicking noise that raised the hairs on my arms. It was the sound of life, but a wrong, corrupted life. Henderson's face was a mask of pale determination in the gloom. Miller hefted the heavy iron crowbar he had brought. I gave a sharp, silent nod. They moved across the open ground with a speed that belied their tension. I followed, my pistol drawn, my eyes fixed on the dark windows of the cabin. Nothing stirred. At the cellar door, Miller set to work. The lock was stout, but he was the strongest man in Blackwood. With a grunt of effort and a splintering crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silence, the hasp gave way. The door swung inward, revealing not darkness, but a faint, sickly orange glow from within. A wave of air rolled out, and with it came a smell that stopped us dead in our tracks. It was a thick, cloying, putrid sweetness, the smell of spoiled meat and unwashed bodies, and something else, something metallic and coppery, the smell of blood, old and new, mingled with the damp, fungal reek of the earth. Henderson, driven by a father's fury, was the first to step down, Miller close behind with a lantern he had now lit. I stood at the threshold, my weapon aimed into the void, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The scraping sound had stopped. The silence from below was now more terrifying than the noise. Then I heard Henderson's voice, not a shout of anger, but a low, strangled gasp, a sound of such pure, uncomprehending horror that it froze the very blood in my veins. Dear God? No. No, it cannot be. Miller's lantern light wavered, casting frantic, jumping shadows up the earthen walls of the passage. I heard him retch, a violent, choking sound. I took a step down, my boots sinking into the soft, damp earth of the steps. The smell was overwhelming, a physical presence that coated the back of my throat. Henderson? Miller? I called out, my voice a strained whisper. I descended 2 more steps, and then I saw it. The cellar opened up into a wider space, and the lantern light illuminated a scene that would be seared into my mind for all eternity. The walls were not bare earth. They were lined with crude wooden frames to which iron manacles were bolted. And in each set of manacles was a child. They were skeletal, filthy, their clothes hanging in rags. Their hair was matted, their faces smeared with dirt and something darker. Some were mere babies, others young boys and girls, none older than 12 or 13. They were chained by their ankles and wrists, their limbs grotesquely thin. Their eyes, wide and vacant, reflected the lantern light like those of frightened animals. They did not cry out. They did not speak. They simply stared, their silence more deafening than any scream. And at the far end of this chamber of horrors, surrounded by small carved wooden figures and wielding a bloody knife, stood Martha Collins. Her gray dress was stained dark, her hands and arms slick with gore. She was humming a soft, tuneless lullaby, and she was looking not at us, but at the small, still form of the Henderson girl, Abigail, who lay on a rough stone slab before her. The child's chest was a ruin of crimson, her eyes wide and unseeing. The metallic clicking sound we had heard was the sound of the knife scraping against bone. Martha looked up as the light fell upon her, and a beatific, utterly mad smile spread across her face. "Hush now," she whispered, her voice dripping with a terrible maternal tenderness. "The angels are almost ready. I'm making them perfect. Josiah brings me the clay and I sculpt the divine." In that single, horrifying moment, the entire monstrous truth of the Collins family was laid bare. The disappearances, the clinking sounds, the manacles, the tools. Josiah, the hunter, prowling the woods for his raw materials. Elijah, the trapped, unwilling accomplice. And Martha, the artist of death, the mother who, in her deranged mind, was not murdering children, but creating angels in her subterranean studio. We had found the children of Blackwood. And we had found a hell far deeper and darker than any of us could ever have imagined. The scene in that earthen chamber seemed to freeze, each detail etching itself into my soul with the permanence of a grave marker. The air, thick with the stench of death and madness, felt heavy enough to drown in. Time itself seemed to slow, each heartbeat a painful thud in the silence that had followed Martha Collins's grotesque pronouncement. The lantern in Miller's trembling hand cast a jaundiced light, making the shadows of the manacled children writhe upon the walls like tormented spirits. Henderson stood rigid, his body a statue of pure, incandescent horror. The sight of his daughter, little Abigail, her small body broken and violated upon that bloody slab, had stolen the very breath from his lungs. A low, animal sound began to build in his throat, a growl of such profound, primal anguish that it seemed to vibrate in the very soil beneath our feet. His knuckles were white where he gripped the hilt of the hunting knife he had drawn, his gaze locked on the madwoman who had destroyed his world. Miller, the stalwart blacksmith, was weeping openly, great, silent sobs that shook his broad frame. He had seen the horrors of life and death, but this perversion of a mother's love, this systematic, artistic desecration of innocence, was a darkness beyond his comprehension. His eyes swept over the other children, a gallery of suffering. There were perhaps a dozen of them in total, their numbers a fresh wave of nausea. They did not cry. They did not plead. Their emaciated forms and hollow, sunken eyes spoke of a captivity so prolonged and hopeless that even the instinct to scream had been extinguished. They were living ghosts, their humanity stripped away, leaving only a residual, terrified awareness. Martha Collins seemed utterly oblivious to the devastation she had wrought. She looked from Henderson's contorted face to Miller's tears with a faint, puzzled expression, like a child who cannot understand why her beautiful drawing has caused such distress. She still held the blood-slicked knife, her fingers curled around its handle with a craftsman's familiarity. "The form must be purified," she explained, her voice a chillingly reasonable whisper in the tomb-like silence. "The earthly shell is so imperfect. I must help them shed it, to free the angel within. Josiah understands. He brings me the flawed ones, the ones the world has already begun to spoil." Her gaze drifted lovingly over the chained children, as if they were a collection of precious dolls. "I make them perfect. I give them wings of spirit." It was then that the full, monstrous collaboration was revealed. Josiah was not merely a passive accomplice. He was the procurer, the hunter who stalked human prey. He sought out children, runaways, orphans, the ones from distant settlements who would not be immediately missed, and brought them here, to his wife's subterranean studio. And Elijah, God the boy, he must have known. He lived in this house of horrors, hearing the sounds, seeing the strangers who never left, bound by filial loyalty and terror into a silence that had cost so many their lives. The spell of shock broke with the sound of a heavy footfall on the steps behind me. I whirled, my pistol rising, to see the massive silhouette of Josiah Collins filling the cellar doorway, blocking the faint starlight from outside. He held his rifle, not aimed, but ready. His cold eyes took in the scene. his wife, the butchered child, the two horrified men, and me, the constable, with my weapon now pointed at him. His expression did not change. There was no surprise, no anger. Only a weary, grim acceptance. "You should not have come here, Ward," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. "This is a private matter. A family affair." "A family affair?" Henderson's voice was a shattered thing, ripped from a place of unimaginable pain. He took a step toward Josiah, his own knife held out before him. "You call this a family affair? You monster! You godless demon!" Josiah's gaze remained on me. "My wife is unwell. She has a sickness of the mind. She believes she is doing the Lord's work. I provide for her. I keep her safe." The justification was hollow, monstrous in its inadequacy. He spoke of mass murder and mutilation as if it were a simple matter of humoring a sickly spouse's eccentricities. "Keep her safe?" Miller roared, finding his voice at last. "By chaining up children? By letting her do this?" He gestured wildly at the horrific tableau on the stone slab. "They are better off," Martha interjected softly, still smiling her mad, beatific smile. "The world is a cruel place. I am saving them. I am their true mother now." The situation was poised on a knife's edge. Henderson was moments from launching himself at Josiah in a suicidal attack. Miller was a coiled spring of rage and grief. And I, the law, stood with a pistol in a situation where the law had no meaning, where the very definitions of crime and justice had been torn asunder and rebuilt into something unspeakable. "Josiah," I said, my voice strained but firm, fighting to maintain a shred of authority. "You will drop your rifle. You will both come out of this place. This ends now." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something human in his eyes, not remorse, but a profound and terrible exhaustion. "It cannot end, Constable," he said quietly. "Not for us. This is our cross to bear." His words hung in the putrid air, a confession and a sentence all in one. The cellar, with its chained angels and its artist of death, had become our shared tomb, and the battle for what remained of our souls was about to begin. The horror was no longer something to be discovered. It was a living, breathing entity that now had us in its grasp. The tension in that subterranean charnel house snapped with the sound of a single, sharp crack. It was not a gunshot, but the sound of Jacob Henderson's sanity finally breaking. A raw, guttural scream tore from his throat, a sound of such pure, unadulterated agony that it seemed to make the very earth tremble. He launched himself forward, not at the armed and formidable Josiah, but towards the source of his torment, Martha Collins and the defiled body of his daughter. "Abigail," he shrieked, his voice a shattered echo of the man he once was. Everything that happened next unfolded in a horrifying, slow-motion blur. Josiah, moving with a predator's instinct, brought his rifle to his shoulder. My own reactions, honed by years of keeping the peace in a rough land, were a fraction slower. I shouted, "No," and fired my pistol. The report was deafening in the confined space, a single, sharp thunderclap that momentarily drowned out all other sound. The ball struck Josiah high in the right shoulder, spinning him around. His own rifle discharged, the blast aimed harmlessly into the earthen ceiling, showering us in a rain of dirt and debris. But I was too late to stop Henderson. He crashed into Martha, sending the bloody knife skittering across the dirt floor. He did not stab her. He wrapped his hands around her throat, his fingers digging into her pale flesh, his eyes blind with a grief that had curdled into homicidal fury. "My girl! My little girl!" he sobbed, shaking her like a rag doll. Martha, for her part, did not fight back. A look of beatific confusion crossed her face, as if she could not comprehend why this man was interfering with her sacred work. Her hands fluttered weakly at his wrists. "Jacob, stop!" Miller roared, surging forward. He wrapped his massive arms around Henderson, trying to pry him away from the madwoman. The two men struggled, a chaotic dance of grief and rage in the hellish glow of the fallen lantern, which now lay on its side, casting long, distorted shadows that leaped and twisted like demons. In the chaos, I saw Josiah stagger, clutching his wounded shoulder, his face a mask of pain and grim determination. His eyes met mine across the tumult, and in them I saw not surrender, but a final, terrible resolve. He knew this was the end. The world had breached his private hell, and there was no returning from it. "Elijah!" he bellowed, his voice a roar that cut through the din. "The door. Now!" From the top of the steps, a figure appeared. Elijah stood there, his face a pale, terrified moon in the darkness. He held a heavy timber in his hands, his knuckles white. "Son, do it," Josiah commanded, his voice cracking with a strange mix of authority and desperation. "Seal it. Save her from them." My blood ran cold. I understood his intent. He meant to trap us all in this tomb, himself, his wife, us, and the poor, damned souls chained to the walls. A final, fiery pyre for his family's sin. "Elijah, don't!" I shouted, raising my pistol, but the boy was already moving. With a choked cry that was half sob, half scream of his own pent-up terror, Elijah slammed the heavy timber down across the outside of the cellar door, effectively barring it from the outside. He was following his father's last command, sealing his own mother, and us, in this living grave. "No!" Miller roared, releasing Henderson and charging up the earthen steps. He threw his weight against the door, but the timber, combined with the angled, reinforced design, held fast. We were trapped. The realization seemed to shock Henderson out of his murderous frenzy. His hands fell away from Martha's throat. She collapsed to the dirt, gasping, but still wearing that same, vacant, puzzled expression. Henderson stumbled back, his eyes wide, finally taking in the full, hopeless reality of our situation. The stench, the darkness, the pitiful whimpers that now began to emerge from the chained children as the shock of the violence wore off. It was a symphony of despair. Josiah slumped against the wall, sliding down to sit in the dirt, his blood seeping through his fingers, staining his homespun shirt a dark, ugly crimson. He looked at his wife, then at the children, and finally at us. "It is fitting," he whispered, his voice now thick with pain and loss. "This is where it began. This is where it should end." The immediate violence was over, but a new, more profound horror set in. We were entombed with a butchered child, a murderous madwoman, a dying monster, and a dozen starving, terrified souls. The air was finite. The lantern, though still burning, would not last forever. And outside, a confused and terrified boy held the key to our survival, a boy who had just been ordered to bury his entire world alive. The unraveling of the Collins family was complete, and in its final, convulsive act, it had ensnared us all in its catastrophic downfall. The battle was no longer for justice, but for the next breath of putrid air, and for the fragile, flickering light that was the only thing standing between us and the absolute, suffocating darkness. Silence descended upon the cellar, a silence more profound and terrifying than any that had come before. It was a thick, heavy blanket, woven from shock, despair, and the slow, ragged rhythm of our breathing in the foul air. The lantern, lying on its side where Miller had dropped it, cast a low, guttering light that painted the earthen walls in shades of jaundiced gold and deep, shifting shadow. It was our tiny, fragile sun in this subterranean universe of horror, and its every flicker felt like the ticking of a celestial clock counting down our final moments. Jacob Henderson had retreated to a far corner, his back to the wall, his body curled into a fetal position. Great, racking sobs shook his frame, but they were silent now, the sound absorbed by the utter devastation within him. He had faced the monster and found a grief so vast it had annihilated even his rage. Thomas Miller stood at the top of the earthen steps, his massive shoulders slumped in defeat. He had ceased his futile pounding on the door, his knuckles raw and bleeding. The reality of our entombment had settled upon him with the weight of a physical blow. My own mind raced, a frantic animal in a cage of dirt and despair. I checked my pistol, a single shot remained. Useless against the thick timber of the door, a grim last resort for a fate I dared not contemplate. I looked at the children. The initial shock of our violent entrance had passed, and now a low, desperate whimpering began to rise from them, a chorus of tiny, broken voices that clawed at the soul. They were not crying for rescue anymore. That hope had been extinguished long ago. They were crying from hunger, from thirst, from the simple, animal fear of the dark and the pain they had endured. And in the center of it all, like the dark priestess of this abysmal chapel, sat Martha Collins. She had crawled to the stone slab where the Henderson girl lay, and she was gently stroking the child's hair, humming that same tuneless lullaby. The blood on her hands had begun to dry, cracking like a grotesque glaze. She seemed entirely oblivious to the fact that we were trapped, that her husband was bleeding out a few feet away, that her son had sealed us in. In her shattered mind, this was simply her workshop, and we were unexpected, but temporary, interruptions to her sacred labor. "The light is different today," she murmured, not to us, but to the dead child. "It makes the colors deeper. The angels will be pleased." Josiah, propped against the wall, let out a wet, rattling cough. The front of his shirt was now a glistening, dark expanse. His face was pale, beaded with sweat, but his winter-blue eyes were clear and fixed on me. "Ward," he grunted, his voice a shadow of its former power. "The boy, he is weak. He will not hold. The fear, it will break him." "He's your son, Josiah," I said, my voice hollow in the stifling air. "You commanded him to bury us alive. What did you expect?" A spasm of what might have been regret, or perhaps just pain, crossed his features. I expected him to obey, to protect his mother, to keep the world out. He coughed again, a horrible, bubbling sound. It was the only way to contain it. The sickness, it had to be contained. Contained? Miller turned from the door, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "You call this containment? You filled a hole in the ground with stolen children and let your wife, let her." He couldn't finish, his voice choking on the image of the mutilated girl. "What would you have me do?" Josiah's question was not defiant, but genuinely curious, the question of a man who had long ago abandoned the moral compass of other men. Lock her in an attic? Chain her to a bed? She was an artist, once. A sculptor. Then the Lord spoke to her, told her of the imperfections of his creations, showed her how to refine them. He gestured weakly with his good hand towards the chained children. "She is happy in her work. I provided her with the materials. I kept her safe. I built her this studio." The monstrous logic of it unfolded in the putrid air. He wasn't just a killer, he was a facilitator, a patron of the arts of madness. He had constructed an entire ecosystem of horror to accommodate his wife's derangement, rationalizing the abduction and murder of children as the gathering of materials for her divine calling. "And the children, Josiah?" I asked, my voice low and steady, though my stomach churned. "How many? Where did you find them?" His gaze grew distant. "The woods are vast, travelers, settlements to the north, a few from the wagon trains that passed too close. The ones no one would miss. The ones God had already overlooked." He closed his eyes. "Elijah, he helped me. He was good at finding the quiet ones, the ones who wandered." The confession, delivered with such chilling matter-of-factness, sucked the last vestiges of hope from the room. This had been a years-long enterprise. A family business. The sheer scale of it was incomprehensible. Hours bled together, unmarked save for the gradual dimming of the lantern. The air grew thicker, hotter, the stench of death and confinement becoming a tangible presence in our lungs. The children's whimpers faded into a listless, exhausted silence. Henderson remained catatonic. Miller slid down the steps to sit, his head in his hands. It was in the deepening gloom, as the lantern flame began to falter, that a new sound came from above. A scraping. Then a voice, thin and terrified, filtering through the timber. "Pa? Ma?" It was Elijah. Josiah's eyes snapped open. "Elijah! The timber boy! Remove it!" A long pause. Then the sound of sobbing. "I can't. The constable, he shot you. They'll hang me." "They will hang you regardless, son," Josiah said, his voice grim and surprisingly gentle. "But this is a worse death. For her. For your mother. Do you want that for her? To die in the dark?" The logic was twisted, diabolical. He was appealing to the very warped sense of duty he had instilled in the boy. We held our breath, suspended in that terrible silence, prisoners awaiting the verdict of our terrified, teenage jailer. The fate of every soul in that cellar, living and dead, now rested on the fractured will of a boy who had been raised in a house of horrors, a boy who had just been given an impossible choice by the dying monster he called father. The darkness around us seemed to press closer, waiting. The silence that followed Josiah's manipulative plea was absolute, broken only by the sputtering protest of the lantern wick and the wet, labored sound of the dying man's breath. We were suspended in a terrible limbo, our fates hanging on the fragile thread of a terrified boy's conscience. I could picture Elijah on the other side of that door, his world shattered, his father's blood on his hands, his mother entombed below, and the voices of the law and retribution waiting in the dark with him. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The air in the cellar grew staler, the stench more profound. It was becoming difficult to draw a full breath, the oxygen being slowly replaced by the exhalations of 17 people and the miasma of decay. The children, sensing this new, subtle shift toward suffocation, began to stir again, their weak cries a pathetic counterpoint to the heavy silence from above. Then a new sound. Not a voice, but a scraping. The timber bar was being moved. A sliver of cool, fresh night air sliced through the oppressive atmosphere, so startling in its purity that it felt like a physical blow. It was the sweetest scent I had ever inhaled. Miller was on his feet in an instant, his face a mixture of hope and fury. Henderson remained curled in his ball, beyond caring. The door did not swing open. It shifted just enough to create a narrow opening, and Elijah's pale, tear-streaked face appeared in the crack, backlit by the faint starlight. "Pa," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm here, son," Josiah grunted, his own voice weakening. "I can't let her die," Elijah sobbed, his eyes wide with terror. But you have to promise. Promise they won't take her. Promise they won't hurt her." He was bargaining with a ghost, seeking assurances from a man who had minutes left to live. It was then that I knew I had to speak. This was no longer a confrontation. It was a negotiation for survival, and the currency was madness and mercy. "Elijah," I said, my voice calm but firm, cutting through the emotional chaos. I moved to stand at the base of the steps, my hands open and visible. "Listen to me. No one is going to hurt your mother." His terrified eyes shifted to me. "You lie. You'll hang her. Like they hanged Old Man Crouch for horse thieving." "Your mother is sick, Elijah," I said, choosing my words with the care of a man defusing a powder keg. "She is not a criminal. She is ill. She needs help. Medicine. Not a noose." It was a half-truth, a necessary one. The full, legal truth would see her executed, but the boy needed a lifeline, a reason to choose hope over his father's fatalistic dogma. He stared at me, his young mind wrestling with concepts far beyond his years. Justice, mercy, insanity, filial duty. "And me?" he asked, his voice small and broken. "What happens to me?" This was the crux of it. He was an accomplice to murder, many times over. But he was also a victim, a child raised in a slaughterhouse, twisted by the very people who should have protected him. "You will have to answer for what you've done," I said, not unkindly. "But you are helping us now. That counts. I will speak for you. I will tell them you were as much a prisoner here as these children." I gestured to the skeletal forms chained to the walls. It was a gamble. The law might not see it that way. But in that moment, it was the only truth that mattered. He was a prisoner, a scared boy trying to survive the monster his father had become. Josiah tried to speak, to counter my offer, but a fit of coughing seized him, racking his body and leaving him gasping, a dark trickle of blood seeping from the corner of his mouth. His influence was fading with his life. Elijah looked from his dying father to my steady gaze, then to his mother, who was now quietly singing to a piece of wood she had picked up from the floor, cradling it like an infant. The sight seemed to break something final inside him. The war was over. The need for a father's approval was being eclipsed by the primal need to save his mother and himself from the darkness. With a final, heart-wrenching sob, He shoved the timber aside and threw the door open. The cool night air flooded in, a blessed, life-giving torrent. Miller didn't wait. He surged up the steps and out into the night, drawing deep, shuddering breaths. I moved more slowly, my eyes never leaving Elijah, who had collapsed to his knees just outside the door, his body shaking with violent tremors. My first act as I emerged from that hellmouth was not one of celebration, but of grim duty. I took the rope from Miller's pack and, with a heavy heart, gently but firmly bound Elijah's hands. He did not resist. He simply knelt there, weeping, his head bowed. He was a prisoner now, but he was a prisoner of the world, not of the dark. It was a promotion of sorts. The rescue, once the horror was known, was a frantic, nightmarish affair. The rest of the men from Blackwood, alerted by the gunshots and the commotion, arrived with lanterns and axes. The sight that met them as they freed the children from their manacles would leave permanent scars on every soul present. The weak, emaciated forms, the filth, the vacant stares, it was a vision from a sermon on damnation. They carried them out into the night, wrapped in blankets, their liberation a silent, sorrowful procession. Martha Collins came willingly, a serene smile on her face as she was led away, still humming her lullaby, oblivious to the carnage she had wrought and the husband she was leaving behind. I alone remained with Josiah as the last of the light faded from his eyes. He looked up at me, his gaze clear for a final moment. "I kept her safe," he whispered, a statement of fact. "You built her a hell," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. A faint, grim smile touched his bloodless lips. "It's all the same," he breathed. And then he was gone. I stood alone in the cellar, surrounded by the ghosts of his making, the fresh night air doing little to cleanse the stain of what had transpired in that place. We had survived. We had uncovered the truth. But as I looked at the empty manacles and the dark stain on the stone slab, I knew that some horrors, once unearthed, can never be buried again. The bargain had been struck, the door was open, but we were all forever changed by the darkness we had witnessed within. The dawn that broke over Blackwood was the most hollow and joyless I had ever witnessed. The pale, gray light did not bring clarity, but merely illuminated the full, devastating scope of the nightmare. The Collins homestead, once a place of eerie isolation, was now the buzzing epicenter of a waking trauma. Men stood in small, grim-faced clusters, their voices hushed. The women of the settlement, their faces etched with a shared horror, worked tirelessly in Reverend Albright's house and the church, tending to the 17 liberated souls who were more ghost than child. They were washed, fed broth, and swaddled in blankets, but their eyes held a 1,000-yard stare, a vacancy that spoke of horrors no human mind should ever have to process. My official duties were a relentless, grim parade. I had to oversee the removal of Josiah Collins's body from the cellar. The men who brought him out did so with averted eyes and muttered prayers, handling his massive, cold form with a mixture of revulsion and a superstitious fear. He was buried in an unmarked grave on the far edge of the settlement, a pariah even in death. There was no service, no eulogy. The earth simply took him, and we were glad to be rid of the burden. Then came the cataloging of the cellar. It was a task that would haunt me until my final breath. By the full light of day, the chamber revealed new, more methodical layers of its horror. We found a small, locked chest containing Martha's tools, an array of finely honed knives, bone saws, and wood-carving chisels, all meticulously cleaned and organized. There were ledgers, not of farm accounts, but written in Josiah's tight, utilitarian script. They were chillingly matter-of-fact inventories, dates, vague descriptions of children, fair-haired, approximate 6 years, sturdy boy 10 years, and notes on their disposition. The finality of that word, applied to a human life, turned my stomach. We found the small, crudely carved wooden figures Martha had been creating, twisted, angelic forms with wide, empty eyes, their limbs contorted. They were effigies of her victims, a gallery of her damned creations. But the most profound and unsettling task was the interrogation of Elijah. He was held in a storage shed, his hands and feet bound, not out of cruelty, but for his own safety and that of others. The fury of the settlement was a palpable force, and Henderson, in his grief, was an unpredictable element. I questioned the boy for hours, with Reverend Albright by my side as both witness and spiritual counsel. The story that emerged was a tragedy in itself. Elijah spoke in a flat, monotone voice, as if reciting a dream he could barely remember. He confirmed his father's role as the hunter, the provider of materials. He spoke of long trips into the wilderness, of watching distant wagon trains from ridges, of identifying children who were alone, neglected, or straying too far from their families. His father had taught him that these children were lost lambs, that his mother was a divine instrument sent to purify them for heaven. The clinking sounds we heard were a combination of the manacles and his mother's work, the scrape of the knife, the tap of the mallet on the chisel as she released the angel from the stone. "Did you never question it, son?" Reverend Albright asked, his voice thick with sorrow. "Did you never think it was wrong?" Elijah looked at us with those ancient, tired eyes. It was just how things were. Pa said the outside world was corrupt, that they wouldn't understand Ma's gift. He said if anyone ever found out, they would kill her. I was protecting her. He was a boy who had been born into a cult of two, his morality warped from infancy. He was a perpetrator, yes, but he was also his parents' first and most enduring victim. His soul had been chained long before any other child was brought to that cellar. The fate of Martha and Elijah became the settlement's most agonizing dilemma. A formal trial would mean involving the distant, nascent territorial authorities. It would mean a spectacle, a circus of horror that would brand Blackwood forever. The men, in a hushed, grim council, voted overwhelmingly for a different kind of justice. It was frontier justice, born of trauma and a desperate desire to cauterize the wound. Martha Collins was declared insane by communal assent. She was transported under heavy guard to the nearest town with a secure asylum, a week's journey away. She went without a struggle, her mind still locked in its celestial delusion. We heard months later that she had died of a fever, still humming her lullabies, still asking for her tools. It was a quiet, pathetic end for an architect of such colossal evil. Elijah's fate was more complex. He was too known, too complicit, to simply release. Yet, the thought of hanging a boy who was as much a victim as the children in the cellar was abhorrent to many. The compromise was exile. He was given a horse, a basic kit of supplies, and a warning never to return to Texas on pain of death. The last I saw of him, he was riding east, a solitary figure swallowed by the vast, unforgiving landscape, carrying the ghost of his family and the weight of his unknowable sins. I often wonder what became of him, if the wilderness granted him an anonymity he craved or simply delivered a slower, more desolate end. In the days that followed, the men of Blackwood, in a collective act of purging, gathered every piece of wood from the Collins homestead, the cabin, the shed, the furniture, and piled it high. We burned it all. The fire roared for a full day and night, the flames reaching for the heavens as if trying to scorch the very memory of the place from the sky. The root cellar was dynamited, then filled in with tons of earth, a crude tomb for the secrets it had held. We erased the Collins family from the land as thoroughly as we could. But as I watched the embers die and the smoke drift away on the wind, I knew it was a futile gesture. The horror of what we had found in that cellar was not a thing of wood and earth. It was a sickness that had touched us all. It lived on in the hollow eyes of the rescued children, in the perpetual grief of Jacob Henderson, who would take his own life a year later, and in the silent, shared knowledge that now passed between every man, woman, and child in Blackwood. We had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had not blinked. It had taken up residence in our souls. The reckoning was over, but the ashes of the Collins family would forever darken the soil of our hearts. The weeks and months that unspooled after the conflagration at the Collins homestead did not bring healing, but a slow, inexorable decay that seeped into the very foundations of Blackwood. The settlement, once a fragile but determined bastion against the wilderness, now felt like a poisoned well. The horror we had uncovered was a contagion of the spirit, and there was no quarantine strong enough to contain it. The rescued children were the most visible and most heartbreaking reminder. They did not thrive. They were housed among various families, fed and clothed, but their spirits remained locked in that earthen cellar. They rarely spoke, and when they did, it was in whispers of things that would curdle the blood, of the shaping time, of the lady with the kind hands and the cold knife, of the endless, hungry dark. They would startle at the sound of a hammer on an anvil, their small bodies seizing with a terror so profound it was a physical affliction. Dr. Loughton, who rode all the way from Nacogdoches, could find no physical cause for their languor. He called it a profound nervous exhaustion, but we knew it was simpler than that. Their souls had been amputated. One by one, over the following year, 5 of them simply faded away, their frail bodies giving up a fight their minds had long since lost. There were no fevers, no cries of pain. They just stopped breathing as if returning to the only state of peace they could remember. The atmosphere in our small church became funereal. Reverend Albright, a man whose faith had once been as solid as the oak pulpit he stood behind, now seemed shrunken, his sermons filled with long, troubled silences and anguished questions about the nature of evil that he could not answer. His congregation dwindled. Some families could no longer bear to sit in the same room with the hollow-eyed children, a constant, living reproach. Others found that the God who had allowed such a thing to fester in their midst was a God they could no longer worship with a whole heart. Then the dreams began. It started with me. I would find myself back in the cellar, the cloying stench filling my nostrils, the sound of Martha's humming vibrating in my bones. But in the dream, I was one of the children, chained to the wall, watching her approach with her bloody tools. I would wake in a cold sweat, my heart hammering, the phantom sensation of iron manacles around my wrists. I was not alone. Miller confessed to similar terrors. Men who had helped carry out the small, pitiful bodies spoke of seeing their faces in the shadows of their own cabins. The horror was no longer an event that had happened. It had become a spectral presence that shared our homes. The land itself seemed to turn against us. That spring, the crops were meager and blighted. A strange sickness swept through our livestock. Calves were born twisted and stillborn. The game in the woods grew scarce, as if the animals themselves had sensed the corruption and fled. The very well water in the center of the village developed a faint, metallic taste that no amount of boiling could remove. Superstition, once a background murmur, became a dominant voice. Whispers spread that we had disturbed a burial ground, that Josiah Collins had made a pact with something older and darker than the devil we knew, and that his curse now lay upon us all. The exodus began slowly at first. The Henderson family, what remained of it, packed their wagon and left one night without a word, unable to bear the memories. Then the Millers followed, Thomas unable to look at the woods where his Samuel had vanished without seeing the ghost of Elijah Collins watching from the trees. One by one, families made the grim calculation that the hardships of the trail and the uncertainty of a new start were preferable to the certain, lingering death of spirit that Blackwood now offered. Within 2 years, the settlement was a ghost of its former self. Less than a dozen families remained, those too old, too poor, or too stubborn to leave. The empty cabins stood with drooping roofs and blank windows, like skulls staring out at the encroaching wilderness. The church bell fell silent. My work as constable ceased to exist, for there was no one left to police, and no crime could compare to the one we had already witnessed. I live now as one of the last holdouts, an old man writing by candlelight in a house that is too large and too empty. The wind through the pines no longer sounds like a hymn, but like the faint, far-off clinking of chains. I sometimes think I see a lone rider on the eastern ridge, a broad-shouldered youth on a tired horse, but it is likely only a trick of the light and a guilty conscience. The story of the Collins family, of the 17 children in the cellar, is not one I have ever shared beyond these pages. Who would believe it? And even if they did, what good would it do? Some truths are too dark to be brought into the light. They only serve to extinguish it. Blackwood is dying and I with it. We are the final witnesses, and when we are gone, the forest will complete its reclamation, covering the scars, burying the foundations, and swallowing the last echo of our nightmare. The curse was not Josiah's to give, it was ours to discover. And in the end, the greatest horror was not what we found in that cellar, but the profound, unanswerable silence that followed. The act of setting down this account has been a peculiar form of self-excavation, a digging in the poisoned soil of my own memory. I write now not by candlelight, but by the gray, diffuse glow of a storm-laden afternoon, the wind howling around my cabin with a voice that seems to carry whispers from the past. I am the last. Old man Haggerty passed in his sleep last winter, found frozen in his bed with a look of permanent startlement on his face, as if he had finally heard a sound from the Collins place that even he could not bear. Reverend Albright is gone, too, taken by a consumption that seemed more spiritual than physical, a final relinquishing of a faith that could not withstand the questions posed by a root cellar in Texas. I am the final keeper of this terrible secret, the lone sentinel at the gate of a forgotten hell. In these final years of my solitude, my mind has turned not to the horror itself, but to the philosophical abyss it revealed. I have spent a lifetime believing in a world ordered by God and governed by man's law. The Collins affair shattered both those pillars. What kind of God permits a Martha Collins to exist? Not as a simple murderer, but as a creature who genuinely believes, in the deepest recesses of her shattered mind, that she is performing a divine sacrament? Was she a monster, or merely a broken instrument playing a tune composed by a capricious and cruel creator? Josiah's warped logic, his meticulous provisioning of his wife's madness, poses a different question. Can evil be born not from rage or greed, but from a twisted, devoted love? He loved his wife. He built a world to accommodate her truth, and in doing so, he damned everyone around them. Is that not a perversion of the very marital vows Reverend Albright once held so sacred? And the children? Their fate is the stone upon which all my former beliefs have been ground to dust. What was the purpose of their suffering? To serve as mere props in Martha's divine play? To be the raw material for her angelic sculptures? There is no moral to their story, no lesson in their pain. Their lives were reduced to meaningless agony, their deaths to a footnote in the chronicle of a family's insanity. I have read the book of Job in my solitude, and I find it wanting. Job was tested, but his suffering had a divine audience and an ultimate purpose. The suffering in that cellar was utterly, cosmically pointless. It was entropy made flesh. It was the universe revealing a fundamental indifference to pain that is far more terrifying than any active malice. I have also pondered the nature of our own complicity. We, the people of Blackwood. Our sin was not one of commission, but of omission. We saw the peculiarity of the Collins family and we looked away. We heard the clinking of chains and we called it a loose shutter. We are a society that prides itself on community and fellowship, yet we allowed a cancer to grow in our midst because it was easier to ignore than to confront. Our frontier individualism, our live and let live attitude, became the fertile ground in which their monstrosity took root. We are not guilty of their crimes, but we are responsible for the environment that allowed them to flourish unseen for so long. That is a subtle distinction, but in the quiet of my cabin, it feels like the weight of a millstone. The world outside is changing. I hear tales of steamboats on the rivers and railroads stretching across the plains. A new, modern Texas is being born, one of industry and progress. They will have no place for stories like mine. They will dismiss it as the ramblings of a superstitious old frontiersman, a ghost story to tell around campfires. They will codify their new laws, build their asylums for the insane, and believe they have tamed the wilderness and the darkness within the human heart. They are fools. The darkness the Collins family represented is not something that can be legislated away or treated with modern medicine. It is a fundamental potential that resides in the quiet, isolated corners of the world, and in the labyrinthine passages of a mind unmoored from reality. My time is short. The cough that has plagued me since that night in the cellar has deepened, and there is a constant, dull ache in my chest. I do not fear death. I fear that the lesson of Blackwood will die with me. Not the lesson of a specific horror, but the lesson of the silence that surrounds it. The lesson that evil does not always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it whispers, it hums a lullaby, and it works patiently in a hole in the ground. I will seal this account in a tin box and bury it beneath the hearthstone of this cabin. Perhaps it will never be found. Perhaps it will be discovered in some future century by people who will read it as a curious fiction. Or perhaps, by some grim chance, someone who needs to understand will find it. They will read of Josiah and Martha and Elijah, of the 17 children, and of the town that withered and died from the knowledge of them. And they will understand that the true horror is not the monster you can see and fight, but the ordinary silence that allows the monster to grow. The story of Blackwood is not a ghost story. It is a warning. And this is my final testament.